You know that feeling, right? You get into a political conversation and it just completely goes off the rails. You start out talking about one thing and suddenly it feels like you're in some bizarre courtroom where you're the one on trial. The rules are changing by the second and it's pretty clear nobody's actually listening. Well, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, pretty unconventional framework that's designed to decode exactly what is going on in those moments. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to lay out the core idea the author calls mirroring. Then we'll get into how to diagnose the building blocks of these irrational arguments. After that, we'll explore the totally different ideas of justice that pop up in these debates, look at a really modern example of how justice gets twisted, and wrap it all up with a pretty wild metaphor for the whole social justice debate. So the material we're digging into is a text called Political Mirroring, Volume 3, and as you can probably tell from this opening quote, it has a really unique style. It's absolutely packed with pop culture references. Now, the point here isn't to tell you who's right or who's wrong. Instead, it offers a new lens, a new set of tools, really, for figuring out why these frustrating debates so often feel illogical and just unwinnable. All right, let's jump right in. The author kicks things off by defining this core dynamic they see in these arguments, and they give it a name, the selfish social. It's really all about the hidden motivations, why people are even having these conversations in the first place. So what does that really mean? Well, in this view, conversations stop being this shared hunt for the truth, and they turn into what the author calls a spectacle of winning. The whole goal shifts. It's not about learning anymore. It's about this selfish need to dominate. It's like you're building a fortress around your own ideas while demanding that your opponent leave their gates wide open. Okay, so let's start breaking down the actual pieces of these broken arguments. The author basically created a whole classification system for conversational flaws, sorting them into different kinds of faults and looking at the shoddy evidence they're built on. So the framework kind of splits these flawed arguments in two. On one side, you have micro faults. These are the small personal complaints. And on the other side, you get macro faults. That's when those little complaints get blown up into these huge abstract concepts. But here's the key thing that connects them. According to the source, neither one can actually be solved in the conversation. They're basically conversational dead ends. So what's fueling these dead-end arguments? A lot of the time, it's hearsay. The author argues that in these debates, gossip and secondhand info get treated like solid gold. The whole focus shifts from, is this argument logical, to, well, who said it? Suddenly, the truth of a claim is all about the source's popularity or their politics, and the actual logic gets thrown right out the window. And that leads to this other pattern the source points out, which they call Tapperist Conspiracies. This is basically a name for ideological double standards. It works like this. A potential quid pro quo is treated as obviously corrupt if it involves someone you disagree with. But if you point out a nearly identical situation involving someone on your own side, suddenly you're a wild conspiracy theorist. This brings us to a really critical question. I mean, if the very foundation of these arguments is built on unsolvable complaints, gossip, and double standards, what in the world does that do to the idea of justice, which is what so many of these debates are supposed to be about? Well, the framework argues that these debates morph into something it calls mirror courts. And in these bizarre, make-believe courtrooms, there's no shared rulebook. Everybody is their own judge, jury, and prosecutor, and they're all operating under their own personal, emotional, and often totally contradictory ideas of what justice even is. The first type is called avenger justice. You can think of this as the offensive weapon in a debate. It's aggressive, it's confrontational, and it is laser-focused on one thing: punishment. The goal is to make the other person feel the sting of defeat, whether that's through public humiliation or just completely tearing down their reputation. And on the flip side of that, you have exonerative justice. This is the defensive shield. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about getting something back that you feel you've lost, clearing your name, restoring your reputation, or just reclaiming a sense of fairness. It's all about repair and getting vindicated. So here's the crucial point. A lot of political arguments are secretly a battle between these two opposing forces. One person is hunting for avenger justice. They want punishment. The other person is desperately seeking exonerative justice. They want to be cleared. The author argues that this fundamental clash is the emotional engine that drives so many of these fights that just never seem to end. Okay, let's see how this framework gets applied to something a little more contemporary. The author calls this one Mueller Exonerative Justice, and yep, it's named after the special counsel's investigation. Now, this is a really key tactic the text points out. It's a sort of passive-aggressive way to imply someone is guilty without ever actually accusing them of anything specific. By using clever language, like saying someone is not exonerated, you create this cloud of suspicion. And the person being targeted can't really defend themselves, because what's the charge? They are effectively denied due process inside the conversation itself. To really appreciate how backwards this is, let's just do a quick refresher on how things are supposed to work in a real legal system. To prove a crime, you need to show intent and a legal act, that they happened together and that one caused the other, right? It's a logical, step-by-step process that's built on actual evidence. But in these Mueller courts, that whole process gets flipped completely on its head. The argument doesn't start with an act, it starts with an assumed guilty mindset. The act itself is just speculation, and the context is cherry-picked to fit a conclusion that's already been decided. It becomes a system designed to confirm guilt, not to find truth. And this leads to a perfect logical trap. Within this system, the very act of defending yourself gets redefined as a crime. If you try to correct misinformation, you're obstructing. If you ask for a fair process, you're obstructing. Just resisting the story your accuser is telling becomes the proof that you must be guilty. And all of this builds to what's really the climax of this whole framework, a really powerful metaphor for what the source sees as the all-consuming, impossible-to-solve nature of modern social justice debates. It calls this the ultimate macro fault. So, the author uses the Marvel villain Thanos as a metaphor for the person who wields social justice as the ultimate argument. It's presented as a macro fault, so huge and all-encompassing that it's not even about fixing a specific problem anymore. It's about wanting to tear down reality and build a new one from scratch. And the metaphor keeps going. To build this ultimate argument, a debater collects these 6 conceptual stones. And as you can see, each stone represents a way to get around logic. For instance, the time stone lets you use any grievance from any point in history as if it happened yesterday. The reality stone makes a person's subjective feelings into an objective, undeniable fact. The point is, when you combine all of them, you get an emotionally overwhelming argument that, in this view, logic can't even touch. Finally, the author points to where this kind of thinking can ultimately lead. They introduce the idea of combat social justice, using the character Killmonger from Black Panther as the prime example. This is the belief that because the argument is so total, so abstract, then physical action, even violence, becomes a necessary and justified way to achieve that vision of justice. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? Well, the political mirroring framework isn't being presented as a playbook to help you win arguments. It's being offered as a diagnostic tool. It's a way to understand why a conversation is breaking down by helping you spot the hidden rules, the bad evidence, and the competing ideas of justice that are really driving the conflict. And that leaves us with a really challenging final question from the source material itself. If these political fights aren't just disagreements over facts, if they're actually clashes between totally separate, self-contained justice systems, is it even possible to find common ground and reach a shared verdict? That's a pretty provocative thought to end on.